There's a country where prison cells look like IKEA showrooms, where a single McBig Mac costs $17, and where the government owns a $1 trillion investment fund that could write every citizen a check for $185,000 tomorrow morning. That country is Norway. And 50 years ago, it was one of the poorest nations in Europe. What happened between then and now isn't a miracle. It's not Nordic magic or Viking genetics. It's the result of one massive gamble, one brutal decision, and one rule that almost every other country on Earth refuses to follow. This is the story of how Norway took the biggest lottery win in modern history and somehow didn't screw it up. Let's rewind to 1969. Norway is cold. Norway is remote. Norway has 5 million people scattered across frozen mountains and fishing villages. The economy runs on shipping, timber, and cod. That's it. No factories, no tech industry, no natural resources anyone cares about. The average Norwegian makes less than someone in the UK, less than France, less than West Germany. The country is so economically irrelevant that when they discover a massive oil field in the North Sea that December, the rest of Europe barely notices. Norway notices, because Norway has a choice to make, and it's the kind of choice that determines whether a nation becomes rich or just becomes another cautionary tale in an economics textbook. Here's the problem with finding oil. It doesn't make you rich, it makes you dependent. Look at Venezuela, look at Nigeria, look at every petro-state that struck black gold and then collapsed into dysfunction. The pattern is always the same. The oil money floods in. The government starts spending. Everyone gets jobs in the oil industry or industries that service the oil industry. Then, suddenly, nobody's fishing anymore. Nobody's building ships. Nobody's making anything that isn't tied to oil prices. The economists have a name for this: Dutch disease. It's what happens when one massive export destroys every other part of your economy. The currency gets too strong, making your other exports worthless. Your workforce abandons productive industries for easy oil jobs. And when the oil runs out or the price crashes, you're left with nothing. This is what faced Norway in 1969. Take the money now and become a petro-state like everyone else, or do something different. They chose different. In 1940, the Norwegian government made a decision that seemed absolutely insane at the time. They slowed down. While every other oil-producing nation was drilling as fast as possible, pulling every barrel out of the ground to maximize short-term profit, Norway did the opposite. They limited production. They said, we're going to extract this oil slowly, methodically, and we're going to keep doing it for the next 100 years. But that was only half the plan. The second half was even more radical. They decided not to spend the money. Think about that for a second. Your country just discovered it's sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil. Your citizens are still relatively poor. Your infrastructure needs upgrading. Every politician wants to spend this windfall on something visible, something that gets them re-elected. And Norway said no. Instead, in 1990, they created something called the Government Pension Fund Global. Most people call it the Oil Fund. And the rule was simple, almost absurdly simple. Every krone from oil and gas gets deposited into this fund, and the fund invests it, globally, in stocks, bonds, real estate, everywhere except Norway. The government is allowed to spend only the returns, never the principal, and even then, only a small percentage of the returns. This is the fiscal rule. Norway can spend a maximum of 3% of the fund's value each year. That's it. No exceptions, no emergency spending, no politicians raiding the fund to buy votes. It's the economic equivalent of a parent hiding the Halloween candy and rationing it out one piece per day until next October. And here's the thing nobody talks about. This rule isn't a law, it's just a guideline. There's nothing legally stopping the Norwegian parliament from voting to spend more. They just don't. That kind of restraint is almost unheard of in democratic politics. So what happens when you follow this strategy for 30 years? You get $1.7 trillion. The Norwegian Oil Fund is now the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet. It owns 1.5% of every publicly traded company in the world. It owns office buildings in London, shopping centers in Paris, entire neighborhoods in Manhattan. It's invested in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nestle. If you work for a major corporation anywhere on Earth, there's a decent chance Norway owns a piece of your employer. The fund makes on average about $100 billion per year in returns. That's billion with a B every year. That's more than Norway's entire government budget was in the 1980s, just showing up as passive investment income. And remember, they're only spending 3% of the fund annually. The rest keeps compounding. This is what patient capital looks like at a national scale. But here's where it gets interesting, because Norway didn't just save the money, they also used oil revenue to transform their economy in the meantime. They invested in education, making university completely free. They built infrastructure. They subsidized industries that had nothing to do with oil, technology, renewable energy, aquaculture. They made sure that when the oil money eventually stops flowing, they'll have other things to fall back on. The result, Norway is now the fourth richest country in the world by GDP per capita. The average Norwegian makes $106,000 a year. They have universal health care, free education, one of the lowest crime rates on Earth, and enough money in the bank to theoretically never need to collect taxes again. From one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the richest nations on the planet in 2 generations. But there's always a catch. First catch, Norway is expensive, absurdly expensive. A beer costs $15, a pizza costs $30. Rent in Oslo is comparable to Manhattan. If you're not making Norwegian wages, living in Norway feels like financial torture. This isn't accidental. When your currency is backed by $1 trillion fund and massive oil exports, your exchange rate goes through the roof. The Norwegian krone is one of the strongest currencies in the world, which makes everything in Norway expensive for foreigners and makes Norwegian exports expensive for everyone else. This is Dutch disease in reverse. Norway avoided the collapse by limiting oil production and saving the money, but they still ended up with an incredibly strong currency that makes non-oil industries struggle to compete internationally. Second catch, the 3% rule is being tested right now. See, the rule was designed when the fund was smaller and the Norwegian economy was larger relative to it. Back then, 3% of the fund covered about 20% of the government budget. Now it covers closer to 25%, and that percentage keeps growing. At some point, Norway is going to face a choice: either dramatically increase taxes or quietly revise the 3% rule upward, because the fund is growing faster than the economy and the government is becoming more dependent on it every year. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question: what happens when the fund becomes too big? Right now, Norway has more money than it knows what to do with, but eventually the returns from the fund could become so large that spending even 3% of them would overheat the economy, cause inflation, and destabilize the currency. There's such a thing as too much money, especially in a country of 5 million people. Third catch, oil is dying. Norway's wealth came from fossil fuels. The entire fund exists because of oil and gas, and the world is transitioning away from fossil fuels. Yes, Norway is investing heavily in electric vehicles and renewable energy. Yes, they've become leaders in green technology. But the awkward truth is that Norway is trying to lead the energy transition while still pumping billions of barrels of oil out of the North Sea. The Norwegian government faces a moral paradox. Do they keep extracting oil to fund the transition to a post-oil world, or do they leave it in the ground and sacrifice the wealth that makes everything else possible? Right now, they're doing both. They're selling oil to other countries while electrifying their own economy. It's pragmatic. It's also hypocritical. And at some point, that contradiction is going to become politically unsustainable. Here's the bigger question. Can anyone else do what Norway did? The short answer is no. Norway had a perfect storm of advantages. They're a small country, so the oil money goes further per capita. They have a strong democratic tradition and low corruption, so politicians couldn't just steal the money.
They discovered oil late, so they watched other countries make mistakes first. And they had a cultural tradition of egalitarianism and long-term thinking that made the population willing to accept delayed gratification. Most countries have none of those things. But there's a version of this model that could work elsewhere. The core insight isn't about oil, it's about the fund structure. Norway proved that if you can create a sovereign wealth fund, invest it globally, and resist the urge to spend it immediately, you can generate permanent income for your country. You can turn a one-time windfall into an eternal revenue stream. Other countries are trying. Kazakhstan has a sovereign wealth fund. Chile does too, built from copper revenues. Alaska has a version of this, though they pay dividends directly